The other things that I have put in the book, though, charming little, I find them charming, little drawings. He writes, adorns the letters he wrote to his mother from St Cyprian's when he was, 1911, he was 8, 9 years old.
Yes, they're sweet.
And these little drawings that he writes. There's one particularly lovely one where he has some insects, and he has written in his awful handwriting, "They will not hurt us," which is very Orwell, being very interested in creatures of all kinds, etc. One of the other things that I think is particularly interesting, at least to me, is I've tried to make clear in this volume, is the origin of Room 101. People will insist that it's in Broadcasting House. The BBC keeps insisting on it. Victoria and Albert Museum did the same. But it was in 55 Portland Place, because that was the office where the Indian services were. And we have a letter which publishing for the first time from 1941, or 16th of October 1941, where the first meeting of the committee for the Indian services will be in room 101 at 55 Portland Place. And quite a number of meetings were held there. Then they moved, the Indian Services moved to 200 Oxford Street, which I think I'm right in saying was Peter Robinson's department store in those days. And
that's a very interesting story, because what did they call? I happen to know the man who'd run the Malayan radio service. When he escaped from Malaya, and he came back to England, and he worked with Orwell and knew him quite well. And he said that 200 Oxford Street was known by all those who worked there as the Zoo, which in a zoo is, of course, like an animal farm. Yes, I think I'm sure that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
I knew him quite well, and I said to his wife is still alive, although she must be well into her 90s now, I think. But I put that in because people, I don't mind if they want to say it's in the BBC, but it isn't in Broadcasting House. It wasn't in Broadcasting House. And we can't find where it was in 55 Portland Place, because after the BBC handed it back, it was all completely gutted from inside after the war. I've looked at the plans and there's no way of telling, but I think it must have been either on the ground floor or the first floor, depending which you call.
It's probably the first floor.
It was probably the first floor. And the other thing that I think...
Well, you've got the very interesting stuff on what he did.
For the BBC.
For the BBC,
yeah.
Which we think has been underestimated.
Well, I think it's been underestimated, because it does seem to me that he did very much more at the BBC than he realised. He talked about it as being 2 wasted years. And in a certain sense it was, because it was very hard to get a radio broadcast as far away as that. Very shortly after the war, a year after I was serving in the Navy in Singapore, we had to broadcast from Singapore to the Admiralty and to the Pacific Fleet. We would get through about 12 hours a day to London, and this was high-speed Morse. If we did RF, we couldn't get that far. And the Admiralty thought this was terrible. They sent a man out to make us much better, longer periods of transmission and reception, and he got it up to about 15, 16 hours. But the Army and the RAF, I'm delighted to say, were nowhere near as good.
Yeah.
They
so
were,
he was
to get to India. Now, it was a long way. Also, there were so many languages.
Yeah.
So, picking up when your quarter of an hour in a week was not likely, to attract many listeners. So in that sense, a lot of his stuff went out into the ether and was wasted. But the programmes he did were amazing. And it's sometimes thought the news bulletins he did, and he wrote something like 220 news bulletins, half of them, just under half in English, the other to be translated into languages like Gujarati and Marathi. But they were broadcast not only to India, but to Malaya and to Indonesia, both occupied countries. And there's a very nice account of a nun in Malaya, Sister Margaret, and it was told by a RAC officer just after the war, Barbara Rigby,
how the nut sisters used to risk their lives listening to Orwell and then writing little messages of what the news was to take them through the jungle to people who they knew who would want to know what the news was. And she says, the nuns, she said, had been cheered by Orwell. We used to bless that good man. And you sort of think of this from Malaya, so Orwell feeling he was wasting his life. But of course, clearly he wasn't there. But the things he did, his idea of propaganda was culture. He arranged programs on everything from the Quran to Das Kapital. He had some of the greatest writers of the day, T.S. Eliot, E.M. Forster, broadcasting for him, great scientists and scholars like Joseph Needham and the people who discovered penicillin. All these people used to do the broadcast. He did so many series of broadcasts, I think it's about 12 or 13 broadcasts, for students at Bombay and Calcutta universities based on their syllabuses. And they weren't just English, there was science and agriculture and psychology. These long series of programs. And you get some idea of the effectiveness of it, I think, partly from something that Lewis Brander said, one of the first people to write about Orwell, who was the information officer for the research officer for the BBC, who sort of said his achievement was no less than to provide an inspiration for the third programme, which started shortly afterwards. And there are two things that are, I think, particularly interesting. One is a letter, just a tiny little piece of commiseration after Orwell's wife Eileen died, from an Indian actor, Balraj Sahni, who, with his wife Damayanti, used to do a programme on Let's Act It Ourselves. And they go back to India and they work with the People's Theatre, and they do touring plays around India, and he writes and says, we've had 50 new plays written to us, we've performed to more than 1 million people. That stemmed from what he was doing. On top of that, Orwell actually arranged for translations from the Sanskrit of ancient Indian plays, which were then broadcast back to India. And this was a complete novelty. 40 years later, one of those plays, The Little Clay Cart, is performed for the first time in London, and this is regarded as the first time it's ever been performed. But Orwell had done it. Well, he'd actually done a shortened version, but nevertheless, he had done things like that, which are incredibly imaginative things. I mean, it was his idea of propaganda. But there's a wonderful report that's recently been released from the Written Archives Centre, where his director of the Indian Services, Rushbrook Williams, has to write his annual report. Now, these were confidential, and in those days you had no opportunity of seeing what had been written about you, so it was genuinely confidential. He would know what he was writing would not be seen by the person he was describing. Orwell has a great facility in writing and a literary flair which makes his work distinguished. Well, we can all agree with that. He supports uncomplainingly a considerable burden of poor health. This never affects his work, but occasionally strains his nerves. I have the highest opinion of his moral as well as of his intellectual capacity. He is transparently honest, incapable of subterfuge, and in early days would have either been canonized or burnt at the stake. Either fate he would have sustained with stoical courage. An unusual colleague, but a mind and a spirit of real and distinguished worth.
And you get the sense of the Orwell presence.
Yes, but well, I think something. I mean, could you say that of our current members of Parliament? You know, it's quite
one or two.
Be down to a very few when you see what we. But I mean, I think that's a wonderful report, actually. But
it's an attempt to capture the weighty presence of somebody. It goes beyond that.
But also perhaps an awkward and prickly presence.